Welcome to the Movement Upgraded podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Jen Hostler, licensed physical therapist and certified strength and mobility coach. Here you can expect to hear about all things movement. The Movement Upgraded podcast is a blend of the science of strength training, rehab, and mobility, mixed with the personal and professional experience to provide you with the steps you need to keep your body pain-free and moving well, so you can do what you love forever. Hello, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're going to talk about the missing link in most mobility work, or what I think is the missing link in most mobility work. So we are going to make sure we're on the same page first and foremost. So the most common issue with mobility work, I would say, is just a lack of an assessment, working on things that you think you need, but you haven't been assessed to actually know that you need. And so there's a lot of mismatching with what is actually needed versus what we're working on. So I'm going to, for the purposes of this podcast, assume that that's not what we're dealing with today. So we're going to assume that you have had an assessment and that you're working on things that you know you need to work on. And if you're a coach listening to this, we're going to assume that you have your clients working on things that you know that they need to work on. So the purpose of this podcast is going to be why you might not be getting results, or why your clients might not be getting results, even though they're working on something that they need to. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So that's us getting on the same page, knowing that like these still are things that we need to work on, but maybe we're plateauing in our progress, or we're just not getting the results that we want. Or maybe you're just unsure if this is the way that you should continue working with your client, or the way that you should continue working on something yourself. So let's talk about the number one thing based off of that information. And that's really going to be a mismatch in the complexity or difficulty of the exercise compared to where you are, or where your client is at. So this is twofold. It is both a lack of progressive overload. So sometimes I would say it's probably split in half. Half of people will never progressively overload their mobility training. And the progressive overload principle is something I've talked about a lot in this podcast, but mobility work has to be progressed. We understand how we make adaptations, and eventually our body stops making adaptations if the stimulus or the intensity stays the same. So that's like a known thing. It no longer becomes challenging for our bodies because our bodies adapt. That's what exercise is. That's exercise 101. So if we're never progressively overloading, eventually it's no longer a stimulus for our body. So that's really important. And this is something that I see in most like quote unquote corrective type of programming. It's this like lack of progressive overload. Like you should not be doing the same exact exercise for your warm up as your mobility training for the rest of your life. You should be progressively overloading some form of it if you have a particular goal. So that would be one end of the spectrum of like not matching the intensity or the difficulty or complexity compared to where you are. So that's going to be somebody who's been doing the same thing over and over and over again, and you're just like, okay, well, I'm not making a lot of progress, or something along those lines. The other half of this is going to be choosing too difficult of an exercise, too complex of an exercise, or too intense of an exercise or load compared to where we are. So this is probably the other half of people. They'll jump into things that seem like what they need because we get ideas on social media and things like that, and we're like, yes, I love this, and we try it without creating any of the foundation to start. And this can become problematic because it's too complex. We haven't addressed like the basics, right? So the way that I like to explain this is when we are doing exercises, it can kind of look as either we're doing them too quickly, so we're just rushing through them. And when we move or do anything, our brain's goal is to take the path of least resistance. So if I am going to do, I'll give you an example, a cat-cow, right? That's a really common yoga move that we all can usually relate or know what it is. If I'm doing that, I'm not being very intentional, and I'm kind of treating my spine as one unit. Your spine is not one unit. It's not just a spine. It's multiple spine segments. We have lots of segments. We have 24 segments, give or take one or two, depending on any anatomical differences you might have. But we have 24 segments. So when we move our spine, why are we thinking, I'm just going to move my spine? It's just a spine. No, you have a neck, you have a thoracic spine, and you have a lumbar spine, and each one of those are made up of several segments. So we need to stop treating the spine as just like one movement. But we do that when we do things like cat-cow. And when we are not being intentional and we are doing things a little bit quicker and we are not thinking about moving things in different segments, we're going to move through what we already have, right? Our path of least resistance is going to be what we're already good at moving, which usually means we move our spine in a couple of chunks. I know because this is everybody that I assess. And if we move in just a couple of chunks, you're just reinforcing what you already are good at, and you're not necessarily getting better. You're just reinforcing what you're good at, which is fine, right? That's still like bare minimum maintaining, but is your goal maintaining, or is your goal to get a little bit better? And I would assume it's to get better. Otherwise you wouldn't be listening to the Movement Upgraded podcast, right? So that is one example. We do things we just do things that are either too complex, or how we approach them, we do them too quickly, or they have too much load. I'm going to give you a few examples to kind of help you grasp this concept. Another one might be like a thread the needle type of thoracic spine rotation exercise. It's the same concept, right? If we're just rotating through it, the world's greatest stretch, this one all the time, everybody's like, yeah, this feels great. It targets all of these things. First and foremost, the more things, quote unquote, that we're targeting, the less effective it is at actually creating adaptations for any one of those things. I'm going to say that again. The more things we're targeting, the less effective we are going to be at creating adaptations for any one of those things. So when we say things that kill two birds with one stone, or we're multitasking when it comes to mobility training, you're actually just getting less effective. You're having less effective training. Now, again, I'm not here to tell you whether that's good or bad. I'm just going to tell you that you can't expect results that are going to match, that are going to be the best, right? If your goal in doing a world's greatest stretch is to move, to feel some stretching, to feel good, by all means, have at it. I'm always here for more movement. But if you think when you're doing something like the world's greatest stretch, which quick little visual for you, it's where we get into like a long lunge. One hand is on the ground and one hand reaches up to get a little bit of thoracic rotation. If you think that your goal there is to get a little bit, maybe back leg hip flexor stretch, a little bit of adductor stretching, a little bit of thoracic spine rotation, and it just feels really great to get all of those things, then I want you to understand that you're not going to get any adaptation in any one of those things very much, for a couple of reasons. One, it's targeting all of them at once, so you're not intentional. But two, it's just not enough time or load to actually train those things. And three, when we are going into a thoracic rotation movement, for example, very often we are moving through like one or two segments. So we're not being intentional. We're not thinking about like moving all of our thoracic spine. We usually are hinging at like one or two segments. So again, we're reinforcing what we already are good at. And that's too complex of an exercise to actually get you better at thoracic rotation. It might a little bit at first, but just like when we exercise, any movement is going to be better and improve your fitness level, but at some point you're going to have to be a little bit more specific to start getting better results or more results, right? So we kind of think about that specificity funnel. That's like the second example is thoracic rotation. I like that one because we love thoracic rotation in fitness, but a lot of people don't even know how to flex or extend their thoracic spines. They don't even know how to connect to them. And flexion and extension is a requirement. It's a prerequisite for having good rotation. If you cannot flex and extend, you will not get rotation at that joint. That's I forget what they're called, some of the ways that our joints interact. And so we just kind of always talk about that. I've said this a lot. But flexion and extension, prioritizing the joint there is going to open the gateway for you to actually improve rotation. Every other joint is the opposite. We have to work on rotation first, and that's how we work on the joint from the inside out. So when we are moving our spine or thinking about needing more thoracic spine rotation, we really got to isolate and prioritize flexion and extension first, and then we can move into rotation. And when we move into rotation, we're really going to have to learn how to rotate through multiple joints instead of just the one that we're good at, which requires a lot of intention and brain power. And if any of my clients or patients are listening to this, I know you're going to be nodding your head, but there is nothing more taxing on our body bodies and our nervous system and our brains than working on spine segmentation, like real true spine segmentation. When I coach it, everybody's just like exhausted. And again, I've said this before, my goal isn't necessarily to exhaust people. I think that there's enough people in the fitness world that are obsessed with that, but my goal is to really make sure we're being intentional and getting the most out of it. So thoracic rotation is another example. Another example of an exercise being too complex that we love to do is the example of like flows and movements. We're kind of moving in and out. There's multiple joints moving. Things like a squat with a thoracic spine reach. I love that. It feels good. Don't get me wrong. None of these are bad, right? They're just not going to be effective. They're not true mobility training unless you've had the prerequisites, right? And 99% of people that I see on social media doing these types of movements, they're doing them because they want a certain adaptation, but they have not trained to set the foundation, right? There's like a hierarchy of things we work on first, and there's a certain amount of time under tension and load that we need to start with. And a couple of like 5 or 10 rotations in a squat might feel good, but it's not actually enough to create adaptations. Like imagine if I were to reverse my workout and I'm going to warm up with my normal fitness exercises and then I'm going to spend the rest with mobility training. We probably would actually get a lot of people would get a lot of results there. But think about it for a second. If you were to be like, okay, my goal is to get really strong. Maybe we won't reverse it with mobility. Maybe we'll reverse it with like cardio. If your goal is really to get really strong and you want to grow your muscles, right? Then you come in and you put your strength training program in your warm up. So now my strength training program is going to be like one set of like 10 or 15 bicep curls. And then the rest of my workout, I'm going to go and run. And I'm just going to run. I'm going to run and think that I'm going to get really strong and put on muscle, right? That doesn't make sense. We know that. So why do we think that in fitness, just putting like 5 minutes towards a few repetitions of an exercise is actually going to generate adaptations that we want, right? So this is what I want you to think about. Mobility training is fitness. It's just an aspect of fitness. So when we do things like flows where multiple joints are moving, again, we're being less effective at every one of those joints. And we want joint independence before interdependence, right? We want things to work really well by themselves and isolate them, and then we can put them together. But most people get the reverse. They focus on all of them together, and then maybe they'll isolate them. That is true for strength training when we're in the gym. By the way, compound exercises should be prioritized, and then we can isolate things we want to grow or things we like doing. So for example, like bench press and like overhead press are going to be far more superior for building push strength and muscle mass for our upper body. But if you want also to build your shoulders, you're going to add some lateral raises in there. Or maybe you want to build specifically your triceps, we're going to add some tricep extension there. So you are going to then isolate like a single joint or a single muscle group. So when it comes to mobility, it's the opposite. We want to isolate that single muscle group and then everything, not muscle group, but single joint. And then we want to integrate it into compound movements, which you're already going to be doing when you're lifting. So this is just getting really specific and isolating first. So that's why flows are not going to be the best way to start. We tend to want to start with them. So that's the reason I don't love those. An example of that also might be something like the 90-90 hip rotations or like hip switches, where you sit in like the 90-90 position on the ground and you're rotating your hips side to side. That one everybody loves. They love to like throw that in there. They're like, yeah, I found this great hip mobility exercise. It feels so great. Again, I love that we're even thinking about mobility, but my goal of this podcast, remember, is always to get you to do things better. So I'm not shaming you for thinking that. I was the same way. I used to do those all the time, but I never had results, right? So just keep that in mind. We're not shaming, but we think we're gonna like make a lot of progress with those, and they're great. But most people don't even know how to rotate their hips without their spine and pelvis moving with them. And again, so that just means you're reinforcing that you're not actually getting a ton of added control. Or two, they don't even have the ability to do so because they don't have a hip, which means their hip doesn't rotate. Likely because they have a lack of joint space and really stiff like capsular tissue. So when we are thinking about flows and things like those 90-90 switches, those are usually too progressed. We've got to regress them to make them more effective. And then you can throw those in. But again, we don't have time to spend a billion hours on mobility training. So if you're coming to this podcast, my goal is to get you to do the things that are going to provide the most ROI for your time. Those hip rotations are not. They're just not it. If you like doing them, by all means, yes, do them. Cool. I like to do them a little bit after. I'll do them in Kinstretch classes because they're always a way to kind of explore new ranges of motion, things like that. And if you do them super consistently, you can get better at them. But just remember, isolating rotation is going to be way better for you, and you're going to get way more ROI. And unless you're somebody who has like tons of time to explore and play, you probably don't even need to be doing those types of things or any types of flows. So that is going to be that example. I have two more for you. Another one would be loaded stretching. We love to talk about stretching and how stretching is useless and static stretching is old school and blah, 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 blah. But we'll say loaded stretching is better. Just lift weights through your full ranges of motion. And here's why that's problematic for many reasons. But number one, the main reason for this podcast that I want to talk about is if you don't have control or awareness of what's moving versus what, when you go to lift, you are not necessarily going to be able to control added weight. As soon as we add weight, remember what I said about path of least resistance when we move. As soon as you add weight, we are now going to be taking even more of the path of least resistance, which is reinforcing more ranges of motion, and our end ranges get cut out even more, and we have less control. So if your goal is to stretch your hamstrings and you want to get into a deadlift and use that as a stretch, it's probably really important that you know how to control your pelvis on your femur so that when you get into it, the load is going through the hamstrings and not also being dispersed through other areas like your low back. This isn't to say that it's bad if you have load going through your low back. You know, I've talked about that, but if your goal is to stretch your hamstrings in that deadlift, then you don't want your low back taking on the load, right? Like that's not as specific. And a lot of people will get into this and they'll be like, yeah, I'm going to do that, and this is how I'm going to improve my range of motion. It's not to say that it can't work, but for some people it'll actually make them worse. A lot of times also it can sensitize our low backs, make them more irritated, and or our backs may not be painful, but it can make it might be loading our backs too much. And the way that shows up is actually more quote unquote hamstring tightness. And a lot of people, when their hamstring tightness is actually just their nerve, it's like a protective thing. And it's kind of our body's way of saying, stop bending through your low back, but you just keep doing it. Now you add weight. And sometimes that can be more problematic. Again, not because you're fragile and it's going to break your back, but it's just defeating the purpose of the exercise. So loaded stretching can be good, but you have to have a significant amount of body control and body awareness, which again means we have to regress and learn how to do that and slowly build our way up. If you are somebody who's more hypermobile, this is you. You've got to learn how to control yourself first, and have that awareness and know and be able to connect. And it's even more important for you to do that. The last example I wanted to give is like fancy banded overhead exercises. We love for like shoulder mobility. We love like overhead exercises that look really cool. And then let's just slap a band on there. Again, if we think about the path of least resistance, that band is actually going to make us reinforce like compensations, or it's going to take we're going to take the path of least resistance again and not necessarily be training what we want to train. It can be hard. It can be difficult. It might feel like you're progressing in that exercise, but are you actually creating shoulders that are better? I don't know. So for a lot of people, they're not ready for those, and they don't even know how to rotate their shoulder by itself. Like isolating rotation is really important. If you don't even know how to control your shoulder or move your shoulder without your torso helping, right? Like this goes back to cars, then what's happening when you go overhead? Like you don't have any connection there. And some of this stuff kind of can help temporarily, right? It can be a Band-Aid, all of that. But like, what if you just started from the bare bones basics? What if we regressed and you just really worked on learning how to move your shoulder only, and then learned how to rotate your shoulder, and then made sure we had enough rotation, that you have enough joint space so that when you go overhead, you have more options. Then we could add some banded work and some things like that, and then progressive overload, right? But that band automatically is added to people all the time, and it's just no bueno. Like, it's just not, they're not ready for it. And this is something that's hard to reconcile in fitness. A lot of the mobility work is really boring, and in fitness we're used to like hard and go hard to go home, and if it's not super difficult we don't want to do it. We also don't like to have to intentionally create our own force. We would rather slap on some weight and kind of have like a reactive training, if that makes sense to you. So I'm thinking about like just pails and rails. If you've never done them, like you have to squeeze and contract yourself, versus like that's more of an internal influence and an internal thought versus external, where you're just like, all right, let me move the weight, and then you're just focusing on moving the weight. You don't have to think of what is moving the weight, what do I feel, things like that. It's more mentally taxing, but that is where we need to be most often to start. It's very mentally taxing to work on those things. We also have a hard time with regressing. We want to feel like we're doing things. A lot of us have our performance, our self-worth tied to our performance. So we don't want to regress because for some reason that makes us less than, right? And you might not recognize it, but if you have a hard time with scaling a workout, that's like a WOD or a CrossFit term, but making modifications and just like switching your programming to fit you, or you're following like somebody else's programming and you're like, it's not working for your body, but you really want to be able to do their programming, even though it doesn't freaking matter. We have some self-worth tied into that performance. If you have a hard time wanting to do these boring exercises and you don't want to do them in front of other people because they seem like dumb, like maybe we have some performance mindset and you only want to like do the really hard exercises in front of other people, right? To show how hard you work. Again, that's self-worth tied into that performance. And that happens a lot in fitness, but I just want to remind you that regressing just means that it is less complex and you are meeting yourself where you are, and you are just doing something less complex, less intense, so that it can match the intensity you need. It is not less effective. Right? Regressing does not mean it's less effective. Like, drill that into your head. It's actually going to be more effective for you in getting your results and what you want. So there is no morality in fitness. Your self-worth is inherent, doesn't depend on anything you do in fitness. Doesn't even matter if you're consistent, right? Like, that's another way we tie our self-worth into our workouts and our performance and our fitness. And I'd like to see less of that. So just remember that like regressing doesn't mean anything about you as a person. It just is going to actually help you get your goals. So with that being said, let's remember that the goal of mobility work is to create healthier joints from the inside out and maximize control. The more ability you have with your joints, the better they work. The more control you have, the better you'll be at everything else that you want to do. But we have to start with making sure that we are choosing an intensity that is going to be meeting us where we are, which kind of does go back to the assessment piece, right? And then we have to make sure, of course, that we are progressing that and challenging it. And it's this fine dance in between, okay, do I have enough control and awareness here? And then once I do, let's progress, right? I don't want you to be married to this idea of, no, I need to perfect this movement before I can progress, right? That's that perfection mindset that also gets in the way of progress. We want to make sure that you are getting like the results or getting the adaptations you want or stimulating the adaptations you want with regressing and making sure we're mindful and feeling what we need to, and then from there progressing. So to be able to make sure that we are matching the right intensity, we basically we need to be super, super specific. And there's a couple questions I'm going to give you to guide you in, okay, is this like the right exercise for me? Am I matching my intensity level? So number one is going to be like, what tissues are you targeting, or what's the goal of the exercise? Right? Like, we really need to understand that, then to know, okay, am I doing that? Do I feel that in my exercise, which is going to be number two? Do I feel what I'm supposed to, if that's the adaptation I'm supposed to be creating? Record yourself. Does it look like it's supposed to? Is what's moving what is the goal of the exercise? Like, do I see that moving? Or do I see other things moving as well? And it's really important to know, again, that we isolate movements first. that's how we can kind of decide if this is the exercise that we should be doing. Does this match the intensity? If you are in an exercise that you've done for a while and you know exactly what tissues you're targeting and the goal of the exercise, by the way, improving spine mobility is not a goal of an exercise. Like, it's not specific enough, I should say, right? So we want to understand what part of the spine and what area of mobility are we really targeting? Are we trying to make sure that we have segmental control? Is that the goal? So to make sure that each segment is individually moving? Are we making sure that we are trying to get full flexion? Are we trying to improve extension at a certain part of the spine? Those are different, more specific things. So we need to get way more specific with our goals of the exercise. We need to really understand those. And as we move down that, remember, I've always talked about this, but the funnel of specificity, when it comes to mobility training and rehab, we've got to move really far down to get the adaptations we want. We've got to be super specific. It's just the difference between moving to move and exercise, and strength training is being a little bit more intentional and more specific with our goals. So if you are somebody who you're like, yes, I know I can answer that question. I know exactly what tissues I'm targeting, or I know the goal. And when I look at myself, or when I do that, I feel that moving, and I can see it in the video that I record. Then from there, okay, is this challenging enough? Is this physically enough for my body? Or have I done this for quite some time? I've checked off those boxes. Then you might be ready to progress. And progressive overload might be a band when it comes to mobility progressions, like ankle weights or a little bit more time under tension. Small amounts of progression is going to be what we're looking at, compared to adding 5 or 10 pounds or adding an entire new set, right? So sometimes it is more sets and reps. Sometimes it's, most often for mobility work, you want to be increasing the time under tension. If it's stretches, you want to increase the intensity. So maybe adding a little bit of weight with your stretches, or you want to be adding more like progressing the range of motion, so getting deeper into the position, or sometimes we will add load. So if you're doing spine segmentation, instead of doing it on your hands and knees, now we're going up to standing, so we have compressive gravity on your spine, versus in quadruped there is not as much compression. So this just adds load, it adds your body weight and gravity to your spine, right? And then from there you might add a little bit of weight, but this is over weeks and months of time. So we want to make sure we are doing both, choosing the exercise where we can actually create and stimulate the adaptation that we need, which requires us to know what we need, by the way, and then also requires us to understand the hierarchy of mobility, which is really isolating things and feeling things and controlling things individually before we put them together, and then from there progressively overloading them. And I still like to progressively overload with intensity or weight or load or time before I will progressively overload, quote unquote, with making it more complex by adding other joints involved. So that would be the next step, but that's so far down the road for most people. Usually by the time you get there, you've been doing very specific mobility training for a couple years. So think in terms of years with this mobility work. So the wrap up for this episode is, please don't be afraid to regress an exercise, and really I think it's just so important to understand what we're trying to do with the mobility exercises on a tissue level, and then make sure it's matching what we feel or what we see. That's really important. We're just getting really specific. And regressing, again, does not mean anything about you as a person. It doesn't mean less effective. It's probably actually more effective. Just make sure you understand the purpose of what you're doing and what they're targeting, what you should feel. And then eventually we do need to add load. We need to add progressive overload. Mobility is not just a bunch of quote unquote correctives in your warm up. That's how it starts sometimes for a lot of people. But eventually we do need to progress. Now, I'm going to say one last thing about this before we sign off from this episode, and that is cars are like your basic foundation of maintenance. Every single day they're a low intensity. Even those can also be progressed if you feel like progressing and working on a certain area. But you're going to ebb and flow with what areas or what things you like to work on. And it's really going to be highly dependent on what your body needs, specifically, individually, and what you want to be able to do with it. And Sometimes people get really overwhelmed about picking what things that they need to work on, which is where an assessment comes in. But I just want to remind you that like cars don't always need to be progressively overloaded because they are a maintenance tool. They are just like keeping your joints healthy. Other mobility work, when you're actually looking at the training of like, okay, now like cars is my maintenance, right? Like I think about walking is like my step goal. That's my like joint health. I'm tackling that. But when it comes to mobility training, maybe if my goal is to I don't know, squat deeper, like I need to add stuff for my hips, knees, ankles, and spine that are my deficits, and I need to progressively overload those. So that's kind of what I'm talking about. Cars don't need to be progressively overloaded. So I think I've had that question a couple times. They don't need to be, but they also can be. And I show variations of that sometimes on my Instagram. So if you're interested, check out at Jen Hostler, and you'll see lots of different cars variations that are progressively overloaded cars. And I use those in my training programs all the time for myself and for my clients. So hopefully that was helpful. If it was, as always, I'm more than happy to hear from you. I love hearing from you. If you haven't already, please go hit a 5-star review and drop a review. It's really helpful for anybody looking for this type of information to see what it's about. And I always appreciate it so much. So with that being said, thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next podcast episode.